What if the person you trusted most betrayed you in the worst way possible? Imagine finding out that your wife, your partner, has been secretly living a double life, hiding a devastating secret that could destroy everything. This is the shocking reality Mike faces when he discovers his wife's affair. But when he confronts her, the truth isn't what he expects. Betrayal, lies, and a family on the brink. How far will Mike go to uncover the full truth? Stay tuned for a story of heartbreak, revenge, and redemption. You won't believe what happens next. Where are you right now as you watch this? Could you face the truth if it shattered your world? Mike sat in the quiet of their small living room, the dim light from the table lamp casting long shadows across the worn furniture. The silence was deafening. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar pictures of their family, of Sarah, of Emily. It was all supposed to be enough. But as he shifted in his chair, a pang of unease gripped his chest. He had been feeling this way for weeks now, but he didn't know why. He ran his hand over his knee, feeling the lingering ache from the accident that had forced him to retire early. The pain was constant, but it wasn't just the physical kind. It was the weight of everything. The bills piling up, the endless doctor visits, the constant worry. His body had been broken, but it was the life he had built that felt like it was crumbling away. Across the room, Sarah sat at the kitchen counter, her back turned to him as she scrolled through her phone. The distance between them had been growing for months, but he couldn't pinpoint when it started. At first he thought it was the stress of his injury, the strain of taking care of him and their daughter, Emily. But now it felt like something else. "Sarah," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." She didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge his presence. He noticed her fingers trembling slightly as she tapped away on her phone. "Sarah," he repeated, his voice firmer this time, "please, what's going on with us?" She finally looked up, but her eyes didn't meet his. Instead, she glanced at the clock on the wall, her expression unreadable. "I'm just tired, Mike. It's been a long day." "Sarah," he pushed himself out of the chair, his movements slow, deliberate. The pain in his leg was unbearable at times, but this hurt more. "I know something's off. You've been distant. You don't talk to me anymore. You hardly even look at me." She sighed, setting the phone down with a little more force than necessary. "You think this is easy for me?" Sarah's voice cracked, and for a split second Mike saw something, vulnerability, maybe even regret, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "You're not the only one struggling. I'm doing the best I can here." Mike swallowed hard, trying to keep the anger at bay. "We're supposed to be in this together, Sarah. I'm here. I'm still trying. But you—" He paused, searching her face for something, anything. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to survive, Mike." She stood up abruptly, her hands trembling now. "Maybe I'm just not doing it the way you want me to. Maybe I'm just not enough for you anymore." Her voice broke as she turned away, but Mike heard the sob she was trying so hard to hide. "Sarah." His heart dropped. "What do you mean by that?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the door, grabbed her purse, and left the room in a rush. Mike stood there, motionless, the silence enveloping him like a thick fog. What the hell had just happened? Minutes later, Emily came into the room, her face flushed with worry. "Dad, what's going on?" Mike didn't know how to answer. He wanted to protect her from this, from the truth that was quickly unraveling. But it was clear that Emily already sensed it. She had seen it in their eyes, the distance between her mother and father, the way Sarah had stopped showing affection. She had felt it too. "I don't know, kiddo," Mike said, his voice weak. "I really don't know." Emily looked at him, her young face full of confusion and hurt. Why is Mom acting like this? Mike's heart shattered at the question. His daughter, the one person he had been fighting for, was now asking him questions he didn't have answers to. "I don't know," he repeated, swallowing back the tears that threatened to rise. He stepped closer to Emily and pulled her into a tight hug. The ache in his heart worsened. He had tried so hard to make everything work, to keep them safe, to hold it all together. But now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "I love you, Emily," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, I promise. Emily clung to him, the weight of the moment too much for her to bear. As Mike held her, he wondered if that promise could even be kept. The house felt emptier, even though Sarah was still living in it. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that a wall had built itself between them, brick by brick. She was no longer the woman he had married, the woman who had cared for him when he was injured, the woman who had shared quiet moments over dinner, the woman who once spoke of their future with so much hope. Now she was a stranger who was always elsewhere, physically or mentally. He could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the clink of dishes and silverware, the sound of water running. It should have been comforting, but it only reminded him of how far apart they had become. "Sarah," Mike called out, his voice a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Can we talk?" She didn't respond immediately. He heard her move, the shuffle of her slippers on the floor, and then the sound of the refrigerator door opening. It was as if she was avoiding him, or maybe she just didn't know what to say anymore. Mike stood up, his knee protesting, but he pushed through the pain. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. He just needed something, anything, to break the silence. When he reached the kitchen, he found her standing by the counter peeling vegetables. Her back was to him, and she didn't even glance over her shoulder when he entered the room. "I feel like we're living in two different worlds now, Sarah," Mike said quietly. His words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. "I don't know who you are anymore. You're here physically, but you're not here." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Mike, please don't do this now," she said, her voice low and tired, as if she was exhausted by the mere thought of this conversation. "No, no more avoiding it." His voice was firmer now. "I deserve better than this silence. I deserve to know what's going on." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes weary, almost as if she was pleading with him to let it go. But he couldn't. Not anymore. "Do you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really think I've been silent because I want to be? This whole thing hasn't been easy for me either." Mike stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Then what the hell is going on, Sarah? What happened to us?" She dropped the peeler on the counter with a sharp clatter, her eyes filling with something close to tears but stopping just short of them. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this." Mike's chest tightened. He had been expecting anger, frustration, maybe even deflection, but this was different. This was vulnerability, and it shook him to his core. "I don't know if I can keep going on like this," she continued, her voice trembling now. "You're not the same person you were before the injury, and She stopped, swallowing hard, her face paling. "I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with me." Mike's heart clenched as the words hit him. She was right, in a way. He hadn't been the same person, but what hurt the most was that she hadn't talked to him about it. She hadn't shared her fears, her frustrations. Instead, she had kept everything bottled up, and now they were standing on the edge of something neither of them had wanted to face. "Is that why you've been so distant?" he asked, his voice cracking, the pain of it making his throat tighten. "Because of me? Because I'm not the man I used to be?" She nodded slowly, the tears threatening to spill over. "Yes, I didn't know who I was anymore, Mike, and I couldn't be what you needed me to be. I couldn't be your everything when I was so lost myself." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Mike's mind reeled. He had known things were bad, but hearing it out loud, hearing her admit that she had been drowning and hadn't let him in, felt like a punch to the gut. "I tried," she whispered, her hands shaking now, the tears she had been holding back finally falling freely. "I tried to be everything you needed, but it wasn't enough. It never was." Mike reached out, his hand hovering, unsure if she would pull away. But she didn't. Slowly, as if afraid the connection would break if she moved too quickly, she leaned into his touch, and for a moment they were back in time, back when things felt simple and good. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with regret. "I never meant for it to go this far." Mike's heart ached. "Then why did it, Sarah? Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me?" She shook her head, her sobs quiet but relentless. "I thought I could fix it on my own. I thought I could handle it. But I couldn't. And now, I don't know how to fix us." Mike felt the tears sting his own eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to let them fall. Not yet. Not when he was still trying to figure out what they could even be anymore. "I don't know how to fix this either," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not ready to give up on us. I'm not." She looked at him, the weight of her gaze filled with years of shared history and unspoken pain. "I don't know if I can fix me," she whispered, "but maybe we can try." Mike didn't know if that was enough, but as she wiped her tears away, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Mike's eyes followed Sarah as she slipped out of the house, her car disappearing down the street before he could even lift his hand to wave. There was a coldness in the air, but it was nothing compared to the coldness between them. He had wanted to talk, to understand, but she had shut him out again. He sat down at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples. He could feel the weight of her silence crushing him, every moment of quiet making the distance between them grow wider. It wasn't the first time Sarah had left without explanation, but it was the first time it had felt this final, this heavy. She had told him she wanted to try to fix things, but this wasn't fixing. This wasn't even trying. He glanced at his phone, the glowing screen mocking him. The message from Emily was simple, but it hit him like a ton of bricks. "Are you okay, Dad? Where's Mom?" His daughter's question made his stomach churn. She knew. She had to know something was wrong. And yet he couldn't bring himself to answer her, couldn't explain the wreckage of their marriage in a text. He put the phone down and walked to the window, staring at the empty driveway. As the sun began to set, the shadow of doubt loomed larger in his mind, eclipsing everything else. Was Sarah really trying? Or was this just another lie? Later that evening, Mike went into the study, pacing. There had been too many unanswered questions for too long, too many gaps. His mind kept circling back to the oddities in Sarah's behavior, the late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the unexplained absences. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know. He had to understand what was really happening. His hand shook slightly as he picked up Sarah's phone from the charger. He had never been one to invade her privacy, but the silence had become unbearable. The only way to break through it was to hear her words, to see what she had been hiding. The first few messages were mundane, texts about Emily's school projects, their grocery list, but as he scrolled deeper, his stomach dropped. His eyes landed on a message that was so out of place, so casual, it made his heart race. "I miss you. I'll see you tonight. Same time as last week. Jacob." His breath caught in his throat. Jacob. He had heard the name before. He had seen Sarah's phone light up with his number during the night, but he never thought much of it. After all, Sarah had so many acquaintances, so many colleagues. But this was something else. Mike stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, the reality of it sinking in. His wife, his Sarah, had been hiding something big, something he couldn't even begin to process. She hadn't just distanced herself emotionally. She had built a life with someone else, a life that he wasn't part of, a life that didn't include him. His chest tightened as he read another message from Jacob, this one sent earlier that day. "You never told him, did you? I don't know why you're still pretending. We're in this now." The words hit Mike like a punch to the gut. He couldn't breathe. His world seemed to spin out of control as he processed the meaning of those words. She had been lying to him for months, no, for years. All the late nights, all the unexplained absences, they had been part of something more, something he had been blind to. His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to delete the messages. This was his truth now, the truth that Sarah had kept hidden for so long, the truth that had been staring him in the face, and he had refused to see it. But now that he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. When Sarah returned home hours later, Mike was waiting for her. The door creaked open, and he didn't even need to look up to know it was her. He could feel her presence, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. "Mike," she said, her voice tentative, unsure. "What's going on?" Mike slowly stood up from his chair, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. He didn't need words anymore. He had the truth in his hands. "Who is Jacob?" His voice was low, cold. Sarah froze, her face going pale. She tried to speak, but no words came. "I found your messages," Mike continued, his voice thick with pain. "I found everything, the lies, the secret meetings. What's going on, Sarah?" Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Mike, I didn't want to hurt you." "Then why, Sarah?" Mike's voice cracked. "Why did you let it go this far? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," she whispered, the tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know how to fix it, Mike. I didn't know how to fix us." The tears started falling, but Mike couldn't bring himself to feel sympathy. Not yet. Not when the betrayal was so fresh, so raw. "I'm sorry," she pleaded, stepping forward. "Please, just let me explain." Mike backed away, holding up a hand to stop her. "No more explanations, Sarah. No more lies." The silence between them stretched, unbearable and final. Mike's heart shattered as he realized that everything he had trusted had been a lie. The woman he had loved, the woman he had thought was his partner, had betrayed him. And the worst part? He didn't know if he could ever forgive her. Mike stood there, his hand still raised in disbelief as Sarah's words echoed in the silence. Her tears fell freely now, but he couldn't bring himself to reach out to her. Every inch of him wanted to pull her close, to hold her and tell her that it would all be okay. But how could it be? How could anything be okay when the very foundation of their life together had shattered? "I didn't know how to tell you," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to fix what was broken. But Mike, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't want this." He stared at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman he had once known, the woman he had trusted with everything, the woman who had promised to stand by his side no matter what. But all he saw now was someone who had betrayed him, someone who had been hiding behind a mask for too long. "Then why didn't you talk to me?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Why didn't you come to me when things were falling apart? Why did you let me keep living a lie?" "I didn't want to burden you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were already dealing with so much, with your injury, with everything that changed. I didn't think you could handle it. I thought I could fix it on my own." Mike shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You thought you could fix it? By lying to me? By keeping this secret? Sarah, how could you think that would fix anything?" She stepped forward, reaching out to him, but he took a step back, distancing himself from her touch. "I was scared, Mike. I was so scared that if I told you the truth, it would all fall apart, that I would lose you, and I would lose everything." The words hit him like a slap, but they didn't come from a place of anger. They came from a place of deep, aching sorrow. He had felt that fear too, in the quiet moments when he lay awake at night, wondering if their marriage was just a fragile thing, ready to crumble under the weight of their lives. But hearing it from her now, hearing her admit that fear, made it all the more real. "Do you even know how much you've hurt me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Do you even understand how much this is breaking me? I thought we were in this together, Sarah. I thought we were a team. But now I don't even recognize you." She let out a sob, her shoulders shaking as the weight of her actions came crashing down on her. I know I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it. I never wanted to destroy us. I never wanted to destroy you." Mike closed his eyes, his hands balled into fists by his sides. The anger inside him was bubbling, but it was buried under layers of pain and disbelief. How could she have done this? How could she have kept this from him for so long? "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've lied to me. You've betrayed me, and you've hurt our daughter in the process." Sarah looked at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Emily?" she breathed. "She knows?" Mike nodded, his jaw tightening. "She knows something's wrong. She's not stupid, Sarah. She can feel the distance, and it's breaking her, too." Sarah's eyes filled with guilt and regret. "I never wanted to hurt her, Mike. I never wanted to hurt either of you. But She stopped herself, her voice faltering as she tried to find the right words. I thought I was doing this for us. I thought it would be better. I thought if I could make this all go away, if I could fix everything, we could go back to how things used to be." Mike's heart ached as he watched her struggle. He could see the pain in her eyes, the shame that weighed on her. But the question still lingered in the air. Could they go back? Could they even begin to fix this? "I don't know if we can go back, Sarah," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were, but maybe we can figure out how to move forward." She looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes, but it was fragile, like a flickering candle in the wind. "Mike, I'll do anything. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." For a moment, Mike just stood there staring at her. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he could believe her anymore. But one thing was clear. This was the moment they had to decide. They had to decide if they could rebuild or if they were too far gone to even try. He let out a long breath, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm not giving up on us yet, Sarah. Not completely." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, and for the first time in a long while, Mike felt like he was standing on the same ground as her. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the road ahead would be long, and the cracks in their relationship would take a lot more than words to heal. The silence between Mike and Sarah felt unbearable. They had sat in the kitchen for what seemed like hours, both too afraid to speak, too broken to fix what had been shattered. The weight of everything, her betrayal, his confusion, the distance between them, pressed down on his chest. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as he fought to keep himself composed. "I can't just move on, Sarah," Mike said, his voice rough, almost pleading. "You've kept this secret from me for so long, and I don't even know who you are anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and regret. "Mike, I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted to lose you." But Mike wasn't sure if he believed her anymore. Her words sounded hollow, as if they were meant to ease his pain, but the damage was too deep. He had known her for years, loved her through so many ups and downs, but now he was left questioning every moment they had shared. The lies, the secrets, the hidden messages, and the silent betrayals. It was all too much. He needed answers, not just words. He needed the truth, the whole truth. "Who is Jacob, Sarah?" Mike's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of raw emotion that he couldn't suppress. "What exactly have you been doing behind my back?" Sarah's face paled, and for a moment Mike saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "I told you everything, Mike," she said, her voice cracking. "I told you about the affair. What more do you want from me?" "I want to know why, Sarah." His voice was thick with frustration. "Why did you do it? Why him? Why keep lying to me about it?" She lowered her gaze, her fingers trembling on the edge of her glass. "It wasn't just about him, Mike. It was about me, too. About feeling lost, like I didn't matter anymore. I thought that if I could find someone that made me feel wanted, I could forget about all the hurt, all the loneliness." Mike felt a pang in his chest. He had always tried to be there for her, to show her that she mattered, but somewhere along the way, he had failed her. He had been so caught up in his own pain, his own struggles, that he hadn't seen how much she was suffering. "But this wasn't the answer, Sarah." His voice softened, but there was no mistaking the pain in his words. "I'm not enough for you anymore?" She closed her eyes, her face crumpling with guilt. "No, Mike, it's not that. It's just, I didn't know how to talk to you. I didn't know how to tell you that I felt invisible, that everything we built together was slipping away. So I did what I thought I had to do. I found someone who made me feel alive again." Mike sat back, stunned by her words. He had always believed they were a team, that they could weather anything together. But now, it felt like they were strangers to each other, caught in a web of lies and secrets they couldn't untangle. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair. "And Jacob? Was he just a distraction for you? Or did you actually care about him?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "I thought I cared about him," she whispered. "But now, looking back, I see how selfish I was. He was just a way out, Mike. A way to escape the reality I couldn't face. The words hit him like a punch. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had used him, their family, as a crutch to justify her own selfishness, and that realization stung more than anything else. You used him to fix what was broken in you, but you never stopped to think about the wreckage it would cause, Mike said, his voice bitter. You never thought about what it would do to me, to Emily. Sarah's breath hitched as the weight of his words sank in. I'm so sorry, Mike, she whispered, stepping closer to him. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't think about the consequences. I just wanted to feel whole again. Mike shook his head, stepping back. You can't just take it all back, Sarah. You can't just apologize and make it go away. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with the pain of their reality. Mike had never imagined he would find himself here, fighting not just for his marriage, but for his own sense of self-worth. Everything he had believed about their love, about their future together, was slipping through his fingers like sand. Is this it then? Mike asked, his voice hollow. Is this the end? Sarah's lips trembled as she took a deep breath, her eyes searching his for some sign of forgiveness, some hope that they could rebuild. But Mike wasn't sure if he could offer that anymore. His heart ached for the family they had been, for the love they had once shared. But he wasn't sure if there was enough left to heal. I don't know, he said, his voice barely audible. I don't know if we can fix this. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as both of them stood there unsure of what the future held. Mike's heart was torn between anger and sadness, between the desire to rebuild and the overwhelming sense that the foundation they had built was now too fragile to support them. The house was quieter than it had ever been. The kind of quiet that made Mike's skin crawl, the kind that pressed against his chest and made it hard to breathe. He sat in the living room, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the empty space between them. Sarah had been gone for hours, gone to think, she said, but he knew. She had been thinking for months, hiding behind excuses, and now it was all coming to a head. He had spent the last few days in a haze, replaying every moment with her, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so suddenly. There were no more answers, no more promises, just silence. And now even that felt like it was slipping away. The door creaked open. Sarah stepped inside, her face pale, eyes red from the long drive. She paused in the doorway, looking at him, unsure, as if waiting for permission to speak. Mike didn't stand up. He didn't move. He couldn't. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal. He felt like he was drowning in it, suffocated by his own thoughts. Mike! Sarah's voice trembled, and the slight quiver in it made his chest tighten. I'm sorry, I don't know what else to say. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've let you down. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just need you to know how sorry I am. Mike finally stood up, but it wasn't to comfort her. It wasn't to make things better. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Sorry? His voice cracked, and the weight of it hit her like a brick. Sorry doesn't fix this, Sarah. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. Sorry doesn't bring back the trust you've destroyed. I need you to understand that this isn't just about the affair anymore. It's about everything you've hidden from me, everything you've kept in the dark. Sarah started to speak, but Mike interrupted her, his words rising in intensity, his fists clenched at his sides. No, he said sharply. You've had your chance. You've had months of excuses, months of lying. I was supposed to be your partner, Sarah, your husband, but I was nothing but an afterthought to you. You let me think everything was fine while you built a life behind my back, a life with someone else. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but Mike couldn't bring himself to soften. She had cried too many times before, used her tears to manipulate the situation, to make him feel guilty for her mistakes. No more. Mike, please. She reached out to him, but he stepped back, the raw emotion in him too much to handle. Please, just let me explain. Explain? Mike's voice was like steel. Explain what? How you let Jacob take my place in your life? How you lied to me every day? How you broke everything we had? He paused, his chest rising and falling with every heavy breath. I'm not your backup plan, Sarah. I'm not your second choice." Sarah recoiled, her breath hitching in her throat. The hurt in Mike's voice cut deeper than anything she had ever heard. It was the sound of betrayal, of a man who had loved her unconditionally, only to be shattered by the one person he trusted most. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this. I didn't know how to fix myself, Mike. I didn't know how to fix us." Mike's anger faded slightly, but the pain remained. "We could have worked through this, but instead you shut me out. You shut us both out. How do you fix something when the person you love won't even let you in? How do I even trust you again, Sarah?" Her tears fell harder now, each drop like a dagger in his heart. "I don't know," she sobbed, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." The rawness of her grief hit Mike like a wave. He had spent so long harboring his own pain, his own confusion, that he hadn't considered what Sarah was feeling. But at that moment, he realized something. She wasn't just mourning their marriage. She was mourning herself, the woman she had become, the choices she had made, and the life she had ruined. "Sarah," Mike said softly, his anger momentarily subdued. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. You've broken something in me, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I ever can." She collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face in shame. Mike stood there, torn between the urge to comfort her and the overwhelming need to protect himself from further hurt. He had given everything to her, to their family, and now he was standing in the wreckage of it all. Emily's voice echoed from upstairs, cutting through the tension in the room. "Mom? Dad?" Mike's heart sank. His daughter, the innocent child who had no idea what was happening between her parents, the one who would bear the weight of all of this, no matter how hard they tried to shield her. "Mom!" Emily's voice grew louder, more insistent. Sarah wiped her eyes and stood up quickly as if caught in the act of something unforgivable. "I'll talk to her," she whispered, her voice hoarse. But Mike stopped her, his hand catching hers. "No, Sarah, not now. Not like this." For the first time in a long while, the weight of their situation hit Mike all at once. It wasn't just about him and Sarah anymore. It was about Emily, their daughter, and the family they had promised to protect. They were all living in the aftermath of lies, and no one could escape the wreckage. As Sarah walked toward the stairs, Mike felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know where they would go from here, or if there was even a way forward. But one thing was certain. Their world had already broken, and it was never going to be the same. Mike sat motionless in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the empty space between him and Sarah. His hands were shaking, though he didn't want to acknowledge it. The morning had come too soon, the weight of the previous night's revelations still pressing on his chest. Emily had gone to school earlier, her footsteps echoing as she left. It was a fragile silence that wrapped around them now, a silence that threatened to tear them apart even further. Sarah had been pacing in the living room, her face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. She hadn't slept, neither had Mike. But neither of them spoke about it. They couldn't. There were no words to mend the brokenness, no easy fix for the wreckage that had been left behind. "Mike, we need to talk." Sarah's voice was softer now, filled with a raw desperation that made him flinch. He didn't move, his eyes fixed on the dark stain on the wooden table in front of him. "What else is there to say?" he whispered, barely audible. She flinched at his words but didn't retreat. "I need you to understand, Mike. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this. I didn't know what else to do." Mike stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He walked toward the window, staring out at the quiet street, feeling like a stranger in his own life. The weight of everything, of her betrayal, the lies, the broken trust, was suffocating. The words she spoke seemed so meaningless now, like empty promises that he could never bring himself to believe again. "I don't know what to do with any of this," Mike said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "How do you fix something that's already broken beyond repair?" Sarah's face contorted with emotion, and she stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. "Mike, please, let me explain. Please." He recoiled slightly at her touch, the anger bubbling up again. He wasn't sure whether it was because of the hurt or the fear that she would keep pushing him away with more lies. "I don't need any more explanations," he snapped. "I don't need you to tell me why you did it. You've already told me enough. I need you to tell me one thing, one truth." "What?" she asked, her voice trembling, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. "Do you love him?" Mike asked, his voice cracking as the question tumbled out. He hadn't planned on asking it, but it came anyway, too raw and too real to ignore any longer. For a moment, Sarah didn't answer. She stared at the floor as if searching for the right words, or perhaps hoping they would magically appear. Mike felt a lump in his throat. He had already known the answer, hadn't he? But hearing her say it out loud would shatter whatever was left of his heart. "Do you love him?" Mike repeated, his voice now a whisper, almost broken. Her breath hitched as the truth she had been avoiding for so long came rushing to the surface. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her lips trembled, and for a moment it felt like everything was hanging in the balance. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and shame. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what love is anymore." The words hit him like a tidal wave, crashing into the remnants of his resolve. She didn't know? Was that the best she could offer? That after everything, after the affair, after the lies, she didn't know? Mike's head spun and his breath quickened. He took a step back, trying to distance himself from the pain that was flooding through him. "So, that's it then," he said, his voice hollow. "You don't even know if you loved me. You don't even know if I was enough for you. You've torn everything apart, Sarah, and now you're telling me that you don't even know?" Sarah's sobs were the only answer. She collapsed into the nearest chair, her hands covering her face. Mike wanted to yell, to scream, to demand more answers, but instead he just stood there. The weight of it all was too much. "I never meant for this to happen," she sobbed. I thought that if I kept it all inside, if I just ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't. And now I've lost you. I've lost everything." Mike clenched his fists, trying to hold back the emotions that threatened to break him. He didn't know if he was angry, devastated, or just exhausted. All he knew was that the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, was no longer standing in front of him. Instead, there was a stranger who had betrayed him in ways he could never have imagined. But as Sarah cried, Mike realized something. This wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't even just about the lies. It was about everything that had built up over time, the broken trust, the lost communication, the invisible wall that had grown between them until it was too late to tear down. "Tell me what to do, Sarah," Mike said, his voice shaking. "Tell me how to fix this, because I don't know anymore. I don't know if I can fix this." Sarah looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix this either. I've destroyed everything." Mike took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know if I can do this, Sarah. I don't know if I can be here, pretending that everything will be okay." She reached for him again, but this time Mike didn't pull away. He didn't push her away either. Instead, he stood there, the weight of their silence settling over them like a shroud. This wasn't the end, but it felt like the beginning of something neither of them were ready for. Mike had been sitting at the kitchen table for hours, trying to process everything that had happened. The silence was suffocating, but the weight of the truth had finally broken through. Sarah's confession, the affair with Jacob, the lies. It all felt like too much to bear. But Mike knew he couldn't sit idly by anymore. Not when the man who had taken everything from him was still out there, living his life without consequence. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, the cold air biting as he walked outside. The anger he had been holding in for so long surged through him, fueling his every step. He wasn't going to let Jacob get away with this, not without a fight. The drive to Jacob's apartment was a blur. Every red light, every turn felt like an eternity, the rage building with every mile. By the time he reached the building, he was trembling, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He didn't know what he was going to say to Jacob, but he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers. He needed to look him in the eye and demand to know why. Mike parked his car a few spaces away from the entrance to the building. He got out, his footsteps echoing on the pavement as he made his way inside. The elevator ride up to the 5th floor felt interminable, each second stretching longer than the last. As the door opened, he stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. Jacob's door was halfway down the hall. Mike stood there for a moment, trying to calm his breathing, but the sight of it only made the anger grow. He walked up to the door and knocked, the sound sharp and final. For a moment there was nothing, no movement, no sound from inside. Then the door creaked open. Jacob stood there, looking surprised but not entirely startled. His eyes flickered with something close to recognition as he took in Mike's tense posture, the fury simmering beneath the surface. He took a step back as if preparing for a confrontation. "Mike," Jacob said, his voice steady, but there was a slight tremor in it, a hint of uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" Mike didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped inside, forcing his way past Jacob. The apartment was sparsely furnished, but Mike didn't care about that now. He was here for one reason, and one reason only. "Why?" Mike asked, his voice low but intense. "Why did you do it? Why did you take everything from me?" Jacob stood frozen for a moment, as if caught off guard by the rawness of Mike's question. But then he straightened, a smirk crossing his face as he shrugged. "It wasn't personal, Mike," Jacob said, his tone almost casual, as if they were discussing nothing more than the weather. "You were distracted, dealing with your injury, your life falling apart. You weren't there for her. I was. I gave her what you couldn't." The words hit Mike like a slap, but there was something else beneath them, something darker. Jacob wasn't just talking about an affair. He was talking about taking advantage of a weakness, a moment of vulnerability. "You're a coward," Mike spat, stepping closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "You used her. You used both of us. And for what? A few months of whatever it is you thought you had?" Jacob's smile faded, but he didn't step back. "You're just mad because she chose me over you," Jacob said, his voice taunting. "She needed someone who could give her what you couldn't, someone who could actually be there. You're not the same anymore, Mike. She saw that. She knew." The words burned, but Mike didn't let them break him. "I'm not the same," he repeated, his voice hardening. "I fought for my family. I fought to keep everything together. But you came in and tore it all down. You think that makes you better than me?" Jacob's eyes narrowed as he crossed his arms over his chest. "I didn't have to tear anything down, Mike. You did that on your own. You stopped being the man she needed." Mike's anger flared, but he controlled it, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I didn't stop being anything. But you? You're nothing. You're a man who hides behind others, using them when it's convenient. And when it all comes crashing down, you won't be able to escape it. You won't be able to run from what you did." Jacob's jaw clenched, and for the first time Mike saw something other than cocky indifference in his eyes. There was fear of the consequences, of the reckoning that was coming. "What do you want from me, Mike?" Jacob asked, his voice quieter now, more guarded. "You want me to apologize? To say I'm sorry?" "I want you to face what you've done," Mike said, his voice filled with determination. "And I want you to understand that no matter what you think, no matter how much you believe she chose you over me, this is on you. You're the one who crossed the line, and now it's time for you to pay for it." There was a long silence as Jacob stared at him, the weight of Mike's words settling between them. He could see it now, the cracks in Jacob's mask, the realization that he wasn't untouchable, that his actions had consequences. "Stay away from my family," Mike said, his voice low, but there was a finality to it. "Stay the hell away from Sarah, from Emily, and from me." Jacob didn't say anything as Mike turned and walked out the door. He didn't look back. The damage had been done. But this was the first step toward reclaiming what was his, the first step toward healing. The days following his confrontation with Jacob had been a blur. Mike had kept his distance from Sarah, unable to face her yet, and Emily was still unaware of the full scope of what had happened. He had tried to hold on to the pieces of his life, but they felt fragile, like glass in his hands. Every morning was a reminder of what had been broken, and every night he lay awake, wondering if things would ever be the same. But there was one thing Mike knew for sure. He couldn't stay in this place forever. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, it was eating him alive. And though he didn't have all the answers, he knew he needed to find a way forward. He couldn't stay in the past, drowning in what had been lost. He needed redemption, not just for Sarah or Jacob, but for himself. That afternoon, after another restless night, Mike decided he was going to face it. He was going to face Sarah. And he was going to try to rebuild, even if it meant starting from the ground up. His body ached from the constant tension, but his resolve was stronger now. It had to be. He drove home in silence, the weight of his decision heavy in the air. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Sarah sitting on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were swollen, a dull sadness hanging in them. But there was something else there, too. A quiet hope that Mike could feel, even from a distance. He took a deep breath before getting out of the car. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to speak. He couldn't let this linger any longer. As he walked toward her, Sarah's gaze lifted, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, loaded with everything they had been through. She stood up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mike," she began, her voice shaky. "I know I've hurt you. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking you for one." Mike swallowed hard. The words she spoke were exactly what he had been waiting to hear, but they didn't come easily. His heart was still raw, still scarred by her betrayal. But deep down, he knew something had shifted in him. He wasn't going to let this destroy him. Not anymore. "I don't know, Sarah," Mike said, his voice low. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can trust you again." Sarah took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "I understand, but I need you to understand that I'm not the same person anymore. I've learned so much from my mistakes, Mike. I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I love you, I love our family, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Mike's chest tightened. He had never doubted that she loved him, but love wasn't enough to undo the damage. Trust was what was broken, and trust was what would take the longest to rebuild. Still, there was a part of him, small but significant, that wanted to believe in her words. "I've been thinking a lot," Mike continued, his voice softer now. "I've been thinking about what we had and what we lost, and I don't want to live in the past anymore. I can't keep holding on to all this anger and hurt." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't speak. She just nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But it's going to take time," Mike said, his voice firm, though his heart ached. "I'm not going to pretend that everything is fine right away, but I'm willing to try if you are." She closed the space between them, her hands reaching for his, and this time Mike didn't pull away. He allowed her to touch him, to hold him, as if trying to reclaim something they had lost. "I'm here, Mike," Sarah whispered. "I'm here for you, for us. I know I can't change the past, but I'm going to do everything I can to make the future better." The weight of her words sank in, and Mike felt a small flicker of hope ignite deep within him. It wasn't a guarantee. Nothing was guaranteed. But in that moment, he felt something shift. He wasn't giving up on their family. He wasn't giving up on Sarah. Not yet. "We'll figure this out," Mike said quietly. "Together." For the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah smiled. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was a start. And that was all Mike needed. A start, a chance. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know how long it would take to heal. But they were going to try. Together. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the driveway, Mike felt a small weight lift from his chest. The road ahead would be hard. It would be filled with moments of doubt and pain. But for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn through the open window. Mike stood in the kitchen, staring out at the slowly changing colors of the trees that lined their front yard. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, everything had seemed so broken. The weight of their problems, Sarah's betrayal, the lies, the anger, had felt so overwhelming. But today, as he sipped his coffee, something felt different. It was the first morning in a long time that didn't feel like the beginning of another battle. It felt like the beginning of something new. Sarah had spent the last few days doing everything she could to prove that she was committed to repairing their relationship. She had started therapy, something she had resisted before, and had been open, vulnerable, and honest in every conversation. But it wasn't just about the steps she was taking. It was about the fact that she was there. Really there. For the first time in months, Mike felt like they were facing the future together, not apart. As the sound of Emily's footsteps echoed down the hall, Mike turned toward the door. His daughter appeared in the doorway, her school bag slung over her shoulder, a small frown on her face. She was still quiet about everything that had happened, and Mike knew that there were questions in her mind, ones she hadn't voiced yet. He had promised to be there for her, no matter what. "Hey, kiddo," he said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's it going?" Emily shrugged but didn't smile back. "I'm fine," she said, her tone flat. She paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on him. "Are you and Mom really going to be okay?" The question hit Mike harder than he expected. It wasn't just the worry in her voice, it was the hurt in her eyes, the fear that this would all fall apart. He had promised her that they would get through this, but hearing her ask made it all feel so real. "Yeah," Mike said softly, kneeling down to her level. "We're going to be okay. It's going to take time, but we're working on it. I love you, Emily. We both do." She nodded, but there was still a wariness in her eyes. It was clear that she wasn't convinced yet, and why should she be? She had seen them fight, heard the shouting, felt the tension that had filled the house for so long. Trust was something they all had to rebuild, together. Emily picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder again. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll see you later, Dad." She turned and walked out the door, the faint sound of her shoes fading down the hallway. Mike stood there for a moment, his heart heavy. He couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the hurt they had all experienced. But he had to believe that they could move forward. That was all they had left, the chance to build something new from the ashes of the old. He took another sip of his coffee and walked into the living room, where Sarah was sitting, her eyes focused on a book, but her mind clearly elsewhere. She looked up as he entered, her face soft with relief and hope, though he knew it was still mixed with the fear of what lay ahead. "Good morning," she said, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "How did she seem?" "Quiet," Mike said, sitting down beside her. He took her hand in his fingers lightly brushing over hers. "She's still processing everything. I don't think she really believes it yet, that we can fix this." Sarah's expression softened, and she leaned into him slightly. "I know. It's going to take time for all of us, but we'll be okay. We'll make it." Mike didn't respond immediately. His mind was swirling with everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, but most of all the overwhelming desire to make it right. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and it wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, Mike felt like they had a shot at something new, something better. "I'm here, Mike," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not giving up on us." Mike looked into her eyes, searching for the truth behind the words. He had heard them before, but now they felt different. More real, more grounded in the work they were doing together. There were no more empty promises. They were taking it one day at a time, and that was enough for now. "I'm trying," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to believe in us again." "I know," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "And I'll keep trying too. We're in this together." They sat there in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything between them still present, but softer now. There was no magic solution, no quick fix. But there was a chance to rebuild, a chance to heal. And that, Mike realized, was all he needed right now. The sun was higher in the sky now, the light spilling into the room, casting long shadows on the floor. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Mike felt something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but it was the beginning of something new, something they would have to fight for, but a fight he was willing to face.